Today's video, we're going to talk about how to optimize your lower half to throw in the mid to upper 90s. But I'm not going to give you the generic cue of stay over the rubber longer or stay closed longer because those cues simply don't work. By the way, I'm Dylan Sabia, former professional pitcher who routinely threw in the mid 90s, and now I help athletes all over the world do the same thing. The first link in the description books a call with me to see if you're the right fit for my system and how I'm actually going to help you throw in the mid 90s. The first step in optimizing your lower half is to make sure that you're drifting towards home plate. I'm sure you've heard this before, but nobody really explains why you need to drift and really how it can hurt you if you don't. It really affected me in my college career when I didn't drift. Before I really understood how to use the lower half, I never drifted throughout my delivery and was still throwing in the upper 80s to low 90s. But all I was doing was just going into the drop phase and just sitting straight down, which doesn't gain any momentum towards home plate, and you're not using your legs at all. So the drift phase is super important, and it's the first part of the lower half delivery. I know a lot of people try to force the drift with like this really wide stance so that when you lift the leg, you're already going towards home plate. But a lot of athletes are really uncomfortable with this position, and this isn't really natural for them to be this wide. Remember, drifting is all we're trying to do is move our center of mass towards home plate. The best way I can describe that to you is thinking about your belly button is your center of mass, and we're just trying to move it towards home plate. One of the biggest issues I see athletes have is they think that they're drifting and all they're doing is hiking up the hip, because it feels like I'm moving towards home plate when I do this. But now our hips are super out of sync. Your hips can't rotate until they become level. So if you're going down the mound at this slanted angle, your hips can't rotate yet. So all you're doing is delaying rotation, delaying rotation, delaying rotation. You rotate late and you can't actually rotate as much as your body wants to. And that's why you feel like I'm just not explosive. It's because your hips are out of line. This is not an effective hip position for you to rotate down the mound. So you need to make sure that when you drift, you're actually drifting and moving that center of mass and not creating it with this hiking of the hips, because it's not going to allow you to rotate and it actually messes up the whole delivery. The reason for the drift phase is you need your back leg at the right angle and positioning so that when you go into the drop phase, you can actually catch that momentum and move forward. If you've ever ridden a skateboard before and you're on a half pipe, you can think about your lower half the same way. If you just sit straight down on the back of that skateboard, you're not going to go down the half pipe. You're going to be stuck on the back of that board, not really going anywhere. But if you end up leaning forward on the skateboard, you actually catch that momentum down the half pipe and accelerate forward. The lower half is the same thing. If we just lift our legs straight up and don't move this way and I sit straight down, I don't go anywhere. I'm just doing what all your coaches taught you to stay over the rubber, which is exactly what you're doing when you just drop straight down. But we're trying to throw hard and gain momentum this way. At the end of the day, your job is to throw the ball hard and in the strike zone. That's what baseball is. Your job is to throw hard and in the strike zone. So the first thing we have to do is we have to gain momentum towards home plate so that when you go into that drop phase, you have the proper angle in the back leg to actually sit and use the momentum to go forward. I know that Trevor Bauer talks a lot about dropping straight down, and he's correct. You do want to just drop straight down, but if you don't drift first and then drop straight down, all you're gonna do is be stuck here. And a lot of times athletes get to this divey quad feeling, which doesn't allow you to rotate towards the plate. It actually takes you away from where we're trying to go towards our target. So we really need to have that first phase of the drift, of moving that momentum towards home plate, so that once I do drift, I can sit and be in this good angle, so then I can rotate towards home plate. So if you don't have the drift phase mastered in the part of the delivery, your lower half is not gonna work effectively. It took me a while to understand this concept that I actually wanna feel like I'm falling towards home plate, because I didn't wanna feel rushed or I felt like I wasn't holding the rubber like all my coaches had told me to, but that's just simply not true. You need to move towards home plate in the first part of this delivery. So once I figured that out, that's really when I first saw my first real velocity gain in over 3 years. In college, I had been stuck in that like 88 to 92 range. And once I figured out this principle, it started to take me into that 93 to 95 range pretty consistently. So that drift phase in your delivery is by far, in my opinion, the most important part to really optimize the lower half and throw in the mid 90s. But if you're watching this and saying to yourself, like, I understand I need to drift, I'm just not sure how to do that, here's one simple drill that you can do. Obviously you need a mound for this. I like to start in this position where the foot's really not high off the ground. You can go higher, but I see it really overcomplicates things for guys. So the main part of the drill is really to get used to that feeling of drifting and sitting. And I really want to exaggerate that feeling and really drift farther than I think is normal, because when you watch the video back of yourself doing this drill, you're not going to be drifting as far as you think. You're actually only going to be drifting a couple inches, which is the ideal spot we want to be in. So in the drill, you're going to drift, sit, and throw. So all this drill is teaching you to do is, once you get to that end drift point, is to sit down in that back leg, and it really helps create the proper angle in my back legs so that when I do sit straight down, so that I can then rotate into my throw and get all that momentum towards home plate. So once you have the drift phase mastered, that you're actually drifting towards home plate and moving your center of mass, then you drop into the back leg. I really do want you to sit straight down. But again, as I've said, if you don't drift, it doesn't matter. You're not gonna go anywhere. I had that problem in college, as you can see in this video here. I'm just literally sitting straight down and not gaining any momentum, and I'm in an improper shin angle, I'm in an improper position, and I'm really not optimizing my lower half at all. I'm really throwing from just my upper half. But once I figured out that I need to drift and get the proper shin angle, that same feeling of sitting straight down was the perfect cue, because that is exactly what we're doing. We're making sure that we drift towards home plate and then sit straight down. So now we completed the first two parts of the delivery. You have the drift, you have the drop. What happens next? Well, this is when you start to rotate. Now, rotation doesn't come from the knee, it comes from the hips and the pelvis. I don't want you to think about, I've heard these cues before of like slamming the knee into the ground. In studies, that's actually shown it can lead to ACL problems because you're putting so much force and tension on the knee part of the drive phase, which is not exactly what's happening. Rotation comes from the hips. For a right-handed pitcher, the best cue that I ever found is you can think about taking your right pocket and putting it into your left foot. I've seen that one work a lot. Another one that I really like is to visualize a rope on the back of your hip and you're trying to whip your catcher with it. Regardless of what cue works for you, all we're trying to do is go from the drop position to then rotate into foot strike so that your kinetic energy can come up the chain and out through your arm. But it's all about the positioning and the sequencing of your lower half in order to have it to where we're throwing in the mid 90s consistently. If we're at all really quad dominant, you're actually gonna rotate out of your hips. And I see this a lot with college athletes where they're very strong and explosive, but their rotation is out of sync. So when their body starts to rotate with how powerful and forceful they are, they actually rotate out of their hips and get really extended here. We see a lot of this like back leg being almost completely straight, and they're rotating up and out of their hips, which also kills the next phase of your delivery, which is the block phase. Because when these athletes rotate out of their hips, their front leg can't block this type of rotation because it's taking them up out of the ground instead of down and into it, right? When we study really hard throwers in the major leagues, their ground force production is insanely high. So when major league throwers are throwing 95 to 100, they're using the ground and putting force into the ground at an extremely high rate. So when college athletes get into this shin dive and start to rotate up and out, the ground force production starts to decrease because you're no longer firmly in the ground. So when it comes to the rotation part of the delivery, the main thing is rotating towards the catcher and allowing this lead leg to block. So the block phase really goes hand in hand with the drive phase because the front leg is blocking because of proper rotation. When we go into our block phase, the block is happening because of proper rotation from the pelvis. If you're not rotating properly, you're not gonna be able to block properly, as I said. But for the athletes who don't throw hard, a lot of times it's coming from the pelvis and the hips coming out instead of rotating into foot strike and allowing this front leg to block properly. It doesn't need to be completely straight. I know a lot of times you see guys like Max Scherzer or Justin Verlander and they have this super hyper extended front leg. That comes down to how those guys are built. If you look at a guy like Walker Buehler, his leg is pretty bent when he goes into foot strike, but he blocks super efficiently. So the fourth phase, the block phase, comes from proper rotation. If you're not rotating properly, you're not gonna be able to block properly. But in the block phase, the thing that we want to accomplish is twofold. One, we want our front leg to be able to hold that rotation as we come through our delivery. And secondly, we want the proper shin angle with our front foot. A lot of athletes who can't block properly have this vertical shin where they land and the shin is completely vertical into the ground. And then when they go into rotation, they either start to bow out this way because this leg can no longer hold that force of rotation coming through, or it's just really ineffective and they kind of just float through the most explosive part of the delivery. So when it comes to the block, the first thing I really need to see is to make sure that we're at a good shin angle behind this front foot and not vertical or even worse towards the toe. I need to make sure that when I land, this shin angle is what I'm achieving so that when I go into my rotation, I can block properly and come through. And as I said, to have a proper block, you don't need to have a fully straight leg. As I said, with guys like Walker Buehler, their legs can be bent. All it is making sure that your front leg can hold the rotation coming through, all the energy come from the ground and into that arm. So these are really the keys when it comes to optimizing your lower half to throw in the mid to upper 90s. It's just making sure that the sequencing is right. These 4 parts of your delivery all come down to sequencing. If any of these are out of sync, you're leaving velocity on the table. Obviously, it starts from that drift phase of making sure that you gain momentum down the mountain. If you don't gain the momentum, everything else is going to be for nothing. You're not going to be able to get into the right positioning, so it doesn't really matter. You can do some of the other things well, but you're never going to be able to optimize the full potential of your velocity if you don't drift in the beginning of your delivery. Then when it comes to rotation, making sure that you're not rotating up and out of your hips, that you're actually rotating with your hips and into the front leg. And then making sure you block properly, not having this vertical shin, or even worse, where the shin really goes towards the front toes, making sure that that shin angle is behind the front foot and that it's stable throughout rotation. I know we talk about a lot of times that 80% of your velocity comes from the upper half, which is completely true, but I can't throw 95 until my front foot hits the ground. So everything that's happening before is really an effort to not mess up the front foot strike and rotating into front foot strike. So if you can keep everything synced up so that when you actually hit the ground and rotate into that front foot, you have everything going in the same direction, that's the secret to throwing 95. It's just making sure that everything is synced up right so that when the front foot hits, it's time to go. My body knows it and I can rotate, block, do everything that I want to do to throw that 95 miles an hour. So that's really the keys to your lower half and how I got myself to routinely throw in the mid 90s and how I'm helping my athletes do the same. As I said at the beginning of the video, if you want to book a call, click the link down below in the description. And if you want to know exactly what it's like to work with me, click the second link in the description where I show my guys how to do much more than just this.